Hello, and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. I'm Jack Wilson, Queen Anne's County Commissioner, representing District 1. This podcast is your connection to Maryland policy and politics, covering the issues that shape our communities and the decisions that impact everyday lives. Let's dive in.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Taking over the mic today is your favorite member of the policy team, Dom Butchko. Listeners, we have a very cool episode for you today and an incredible guest. This gentleman is the definition of a scholar and a true friend to local governments. We have, drum roll please, Zach Schafer, the Assistant Secretary for the Maryland Department of Environment. Zach, how you feeling today?
Well, after that intro, good, laying it on thick, man. I like it.
We're like, what, 3 weeks away from session? So I gotta get it in now. Now, I'm not kidding. Zach and I are very close. I think we talk at least 2 or 3 times a week. And I'm not exaggerating when I say, like, you really are a rock star within MDE. You've been there for at least a year, 2 years, and the changes you've been able to make, the relationships, it's awesome. But our listeners really don't know you as well as I do. They're not talking with you all the time. So before we kind of jump in and talk policy and kind of scratch that nerdy itch, I want to talk about you. So first, Zach, give us your background. How do you become, Assistant Secretary and Grand Poobah at MDE?
Well, thanks. I'm glad I've made it feel like it's been as long as 2 years. It's only actually been 11 months, but it's a frequent.
Has it really only been 11 months?
It's only been 11. Yeah. So I started in late January of 2025. So I have been at the department now for almost a year, and it's been a great ride. It's been a really, really great experience. I love Maryland. I grew up spending my summers, at least, in Elkton, up in Cecil County, where my family's been for about 100 years. And so, like, to the extent, modern world, move around a lot, but to the extent anywhere feels like home, it's the Eastern Shore, it's the Chesapeake, and the Elk River in particular is my old boss at EPA used to ice break conversations by asking people what their favorite body of water was, and so I always said the Elk River.
By the way, that is just a very particular demographic you're playing to. What's your favorite body of water? Well, it's the
EPA Office of Water, so it kind of fit with most of our constituents. But I think it's a really good question because I think everybody, no matter what you do, where you live, everybody's got a favorite body of water, like something that they grew up going on family vacations to somewhere, or playing in some pond or stream. Everybody's got something, and I think water is a really cool way of connecting with people. And I think it's, I'm an MDE. We obviously work on air issues, land issues, water issues, infrastructure, finance. But I will say water is where my heart is. And so to your question about how you get here. So I came to the department in January after 4 years at the EPA, where I was director of policy at EPA's Office of Water, which is sort of the national water program for the country, at least when it comes to things like safe drinking water, protecting streams, rivers, lakes, thinking about pollutants and contaminants in our water, thinking about the impacts of climate change on water resources, because water is how we most frequently feel the impacts of climate change. So that was a really great experience, and it gave me sort of a national outlook on water politics, water policy, and then by extension into a lot of the work that's happening in the states. So it was a great experience, and then just through opportunities and colleagues, landed here at the Department of the Environment, and really love it.
So how long were you at EPA for?
So I was at EPA for almost 4 years during the Biden administration. So I was on the political side of there. So when the Biden administration wrapped up, I was moving on. And, it's just really great to, have it's not just me. There's so many folks who have gone into state government, following that, and, both bringing a lot, but also learning a lot about, what it's, like closer to the ground at the state level. So it's exciting for me. And, before that, I ran an infrastructure advocacy nonprofit. So that was a different kind of perspective too. It was like a big business, big labor. We can't agree that it's Monday, but we can agree that the federal government should invest more in infrastructure across the nation. So I worked with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the AFL-CIO, and hundreds of other organizations around the country to build momentum and support for what ultimately became the infrastructure bill in 2021. So brought that experience to EPA. So my background is in infrastructure writ large, and in particular water infrastructure and now water policy writ large.
So Zach, you've occupied two things that I like to call cool jobs. Like they're jobs where you're looking at and you're in high school or something, you're like, I wanna do that. I want to be the assistant secretary and handle an infrastructure. I want to be at the EPA doing water stuff. And so but the path to get there isn't always a straight line. And so like for example, on my side of it, like I started as an elected official in Pennsylvania, got my master's. I actually struggled to find my first job out of college, randomly landed in Montgomery County, and then just by happenstance and luck landed at Mako. How do you like you were at EPA, and then you ended up as assistant secretary, but like trace that path up. How did you climb the ladder, and do you have any like life lessons or advice for someone like that?
It's a great question. I mean, the short answer is I have absolutely no idea. I spent a long time being jealous of my best friend from college who grew up knowing that he wanted to be a doctor. And there's like a path. You want to be a doctor. It's like you get your undergrad degree, you go to med school, you do a residency, you do a fellowship, you become a whatever they call it, not attending physician, and then you become like the path steps are very clear. You might, not know exactly where you're going to go or what your specialty is. That is not what my career has been like. I've never known really what the next step is going to be. But when I look backwards, it all makes sense. I've worked in energy and environmental politics, policy, consulting. I've worked in the private sector, the public sector, for my whole career, but I never knew sort of what I wanted to do next. But I always picked, what seemed like the right opportunity at the time. Sometimes that panned out. Sometimes it didn't really pan out very well. Had a couple jobs where you stay for a short time and then move on. But I think the biggest thing is just relying on people. I mean, at the end of the day, people are what make all of this happen. And so, those networks, those relationships. I see that now in Maryland. It's interesting jumping from the federal level to the state level. It's an entirely different ecosystem of people who make the state world go round than who make the federal world go round. Obviously, there's connections and they impact each other. But no, so it's one of the things about jumping into this position is that first and foremost you got to meet the people. You got to learn who knows how to make things happen at the county level, at the really local level, in different state agencies. And so a big part of the learning curve, for me, it's not just learning the intricacies of Maryland policy and COMAR versus the Federal Register. It's really about learning the people and learning sort of what people want. What does Maryland want to achieve? What do counties want to achieve? What do local governments want to achieve? And, and making sure that you're being, everybody's bringing a fair perspective to all these issues. And so it's a lot of, reaching out, and it's a lot of listening and not making assumptions about people's intentions or what's driving them, and then finding the best path forward.
So you actually kind of great opener to my next question. I wanted to talk about the difference, and you've sat in a number of seats, the difference between state politics versus federal politics, Annapolis versus DC. I mean, you've sat in the executive at the federal and now at the state level. You've also dealt with the legislative side. You and I have dealt with the General Assembly last year. We will this year. You've dealt with Congress before. So I guess like high level, what are the big kind of differences or similarities? And tell us why you like the state level more.
I do actually like the state level more. I think that one of the biggest differences is the speed. And I don't know, maybe there's some people who feel like Annapolis isn't that fast, but to me it is like light speed compared to the federal level, where it takes years, sometimes decades, for policy concepts to get distilled and formulated and socialized. And, it's like, I feel like I joined a couple weeks into session this past year. And, in just the couple months of session that I was there for, I saw bills be ideated and, look like they were going to completely it looked like they were going to pass, and then they were going to fail, and then they were going to pass again, and just like
Oh, it's an
there's
emotional roller coaster. Like if you're
there's
not familiar.
absolutely, it is such a roller coaster. I would not describe the federal pace of things as a roller coaster. I mean, it's wild to be sure,
Mhm.
but what that has meant for me is that I feel like there's just actually an enormous, or at least a much greater ability to impact policy direction in the state because of how much easier it's a smaller group of people trying to make things happen and make things work, and so you can actually get everybody in a room and try to hear what's the pain point for someone, or why is someone bringing an issue up, and try to find a resolution to it. It doesn't mean you always find a happy medium or a happy resolution, but you can at least understand, like, why is someone really pushing something, why is someone pushing back against something, and the flexibility and the ability to pivot quickly at the state level is really, really interesting and exciting. And at the federal level, certainly I was at EPA headquarters. EPA, most federal agencies have regions around the country, so they do work closely with states. But at EPA headquarters, we're making national policy, and we certainly listen to all the voices we can. But it can feel a little bit removed at times, and um, and so if we were hearing about a specific place name or a place on a map, for instance, it was because things had just gotten so bad that there was going to be nothing fun about it. We were solving the absolute hardest problems that were rising up to the level of the EPA administrator's office or the assistant administrator's office. Whereas at the state level, I mean, there's plenty of crises and bad situations to respond to, but that's the bread and butter. Like, that's just what we do. And there's good news stories, there's bad news stories, there's a lot of things that are just in between, where it's like there's someone who's trying to build a development who's running into some challenges and questions, and how can we help resolve those. There's a family who I worked with, who their well had run dry about 8 or 9 months ago, and they were just trying to navigate the system, and the system was failing them. We were able to help them, with the help of county government, get a new well drilled finally, and they could finally take a shower and drink water out of their tap. That's the kind of work that you never get to do at the federal level, because you're just you're trying to do things across the whole country. And at the state, we are working directly with residents, directly with county governments, local governments, as well as our peers in other states. So it's definitely different. There's definitely similarities, but it's a lot of fun. The other thing I'll say is it's fun to see things I did at the federal level playing out in implementation at the state level. I worked at EPA to help create the national drinking water standards for certain PFAS. And now Maryland, we're implementing those. Every state is implementing those. And so getting to see the fruits of that work, which did take a long time, but was very thoughtful, seeing it play out in generally a pretty positive way here. Or similarly, I worked a lot on water sector cybersecurity at EPA, and it was a really, really hot, tense issue at the federal level. At the state level, there's a lot more consensus that this is a problem and we can do something about it. We just need to work together. There's a new bill that's being implemented that passed the state legislature this year, which, again, another example of things moving way faster at the state level than at the federal level. So those are my reflections after almost a year in this role.
So that point you brought up about the EPA, where you mostly saw the real challenges, I thought that's really interesting, and I want to pull that thread a little bit. Is that because EPA, you're divided into regions? Maryland, we're in Region 3, along with, I think, like Pennsylvania, Virginia, and a couple of others. But is that because the regions are handling all of the easy stuff and the good stuff, and so it's like, instead of crap flowing downhill, it flows uphill in DC. You know what I mean?
Well, maybe a little bit. I mean, I'm sure my regional colleagues and former colleagues would laugh if I said they got the easy stuff and the hard stuff. No, it's I think it's just that at headquarters, you're crafting policy. It's like you're taking just the same way that we do at the state level. The General Assembly passes a law. We've got to figure out how to implement it. We've got to figure out if there's, are there implementing regulations that need to be created? Are there regulations that need to be updated? How do they interact with other parts of government? How are we going to pay for it? So we're creating policy at the state level too. It's just a lot closer to the action. At the federal level, you're just another step removed from that. A lot of what we do at the federal level is create regulations that states then they implement. So Maryland has what's called primacy. So Maryland is actually implementing, MDE is implementing many federal regulations that are created, in Washington and with input from states and from EPA regions. But the state, applies. States can apply for primacy to administer, certain regulations under the Safe Drinking Water Act or the Clean Air Act, and so a lot of it does play out still at the state level, but it's at the federal level where you're saying what's the basic floor of protection that every state, every community should have, and how do we implement that?
So talk a little bit too. I mean, I think no one can imagine a more stark contrast between the transition of administrations that we've seen in DC. So like Biden versus Trump, it's like night and day. And a state like Maryland, where we're a small state, but we're really ambitious, trying to, implement and do a lot of things, both federal and state policy, that transition's been a little rough. Can you talk a little bit about, what is MDE seeing? How are you kind of managing that? And what is the outlook, over the short, medium, long term there? What are you guys doing? What are you thinking? How are you handling it?
It's a good question. I mean, there's definitely differences, obviously, and impacts. Federal funding is obviously one of the first questions that comes to mind, and there's a lot of funding that MDE, for example, administers, but it's coming from the federal government. So a lot of the water infrastructure funding, for instance, is federal money that comes to Maryland, and then we loan that out or grant that out ourselves. Like, we're the ones making decisions about who gets that money, and we get to reinvest that money as if they're loans, they get repaid back to us. But there was some uncertainty about based on the president's budget, that might have affected those funds. In the end, it didn't. Congress protected them, and so we were really grateful to still have the full volume of appropriations for those water infrastructure funds. But there's been other funds that hasn't been the case for. The environmental justice block grants that we know were coming to Maryland, and we were going to be using for, or grantee or grant recipients in Maryland were going to be using to monitor for certain pollutants in the air, or do climate justice and climate resilience projects in communities across the state. And so those funds have been frozen. A lot of the funds some of the funds are locked in litigation.
The energy funds were frozen. We were supposed to get several $100 million in energy grants, and they were just taken off the table.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's been really disappointing to work through that. Some of it's still in litigation. I know there was a recent court decision that may unlock some FEMA funds that were going to be helping communities, including in Maryland, doing flood. There's the general rule of thumb that a dollar invested in disaster, especially flood protection, is worth $6 or $7 of recovery. And so there were those kinds of funds. I mean, when I think about being fiscally responsible, fiscally conservative, there's nothing to me that's more appropriate than investing in prevention. That's investing in resilience upfront rather than rebuilding and recovering after the fact. And so there were a lot of funds in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in the Inflation Reduction Act that were targeted toward doing that. Some of that's still happening, but yeah, a lot of those funds have been frozen too. And then it's also just navigating, the regulatory changes at the federal level. Maryland, MDE is constantly determining whether it's going to provide comments on federal rules. If it might challenge certain federal rules in court. Ultimately, we have to comment on a rule change if we're to preserve our ability to challenge it later in the courts. So yeah, there's just it has been a bit of whiplash. For the state, certainly in a lot of different areas. There are some areas where, the work is continuing. I mean, I will say at a day-to-day level, our relationship with EPA staff, there's lots of things where we're working every day on things where they have to review something that we're doing. And a lot of that work is just continuing normally, to the extent that EPA may be shedding employees. I mean, there's a lot of retirements. There have been some reductions in staff. That definitely affects us, and that affects Marylanders for sure. Some of those people are Marylanders too, and that's certainly painful for all of us. But a lot of the relationship with EPA regional staff remains really strong. And there's been some reassuring decisions too coming out of EPA. For instance, I know we're going to talk about PFAS, but for instance, preserving the Superfund law or the Superfund regulation that EPA promulgated in 2024 that allows states like Maryland to hold real polluters accountable for and to pay for the cleanup costs associated with certain pollution activities. So there's bright spots, but yeah, there's a lot of whiplash, and it's also disappointing to see things that you just personally that you worked on being altered in not the way that I would choose to change things.
So I gotta say, keep jumping ahead, but you did mention PFAS, so I think this is a good point to transition and dig a little deeper into the policy side of it now. So let's start with that. 4 letters, PFAS. We've been touching on this at Mako for a number of years, probably since I started. So just to kick off the conversation, Zach, give us a little primer, like what is PFAS? And more importantly, why should county governments, the policymakers listening to this, why should they care about these 4 really important letters?
It's a great question. And yeah, PFAS definitely have become a 4-letter word, I think, globally. And I think that's important to recognize. This is a global issue. This is not it's not just a Maryland issue or a X county issue. This is a global issue. This is going to be for our generation, for our time, what, lead and asbestos and PCBs have been, in other recent decades. And it's not to say that we've completely solved the lead problems that we face either, but in terms of our understanding of where public health risks are coming from in terms of environmental contaminants, PFAS are they loom large. I would say like PFAS and microplastics are definitely issues that keep me up at night. They're issues that occupied an enormous amount of our time at EPA. And PFAS, and I'll say it's not PFAS it's PFAS are, because there's 15,000 or more of these chemicals. It's a group or a family of these chemicals that were invented in the 1940s, initially just over the border in Delaware by DuPont. But since then have been, other types of PFAS have been invented by lots of corporations around the country and used because they're incredibly useful. I'm not in any way denying how important they've been to a lot of the things that we use, the things that we own, the processes that make our world go round. But they because they have these properties, they're stain resistant, they're water resistant, they're heat resistant, fire resistant. They don't degrade over time.
They were miracle chemicals for a while. They were pushed as they're in firefighting foam, they're in rugs, they're oh my God, they're in popcorn bags, aren't they?
Popcorn bag, yeah, food pack. If you get some food on packaging that that the packaging doesn't absorb that grease, it's because there's a good chance they're coated in PFAS, which doesn't absorb oil. It's frequently in products that you apply to your skin, like cosmetics or sunscreen, that says water resistant or won't run. There are alternatives out there. I want to be clear that there are alternatives to PFAS, but those are some of the use cases of them. And yeah, they're on our clothes, on our our waterproof jackets and shoes, on in products that we put on our bodies, that we use in our kitchens. They're also really important in a lot of industrial processes, like in manufacturing semiconductors, in the automotive sector. And yeah, you mentioned firefighting foam. Like they were the active ingredient. They are the active ingredient in a lot of firefighting foams that are used at military bases and at airports, and so that's where we see a lot of the contamination coming from now. And we're glad that there are, in that case too, there are alternatives. We definitely are not opposed to putting out fires, but we want to recognize what the different kinds of risks are.
I'd say that's a very bipartisan issue. I don't think anyone is opposed to putting out fires, but I'm glad to get you on the record.
You'd be surprised. I could tell you stories from my federal work.
in Annapolis. This is why the state level's better.
That's right. But incredibly, incredibly useful. But a lot of the properties that have made them very useful. Oh, and pesticides, I know, is another issue that's come up in Maryland. They are, the active ingredient in some pesticides. They've also been found as an inactive ingredient, but used in the containers for pesticides that can then leach into the product in the container. But as we've been learning more and more about PFAS over the last few years and decades, we've been learning that some of those PFAS, and I say some because, again, there's thousands of these. We don't know about as much as we would like to know and need to know about all of them, but we do know a lot about some of them. And so you'll, to the extent that people are tracking this issue at home, because I know everybody eats and lives and breathes this as much as you and I do. There's PFOA and PFOS are two specific PFAS. They're some of the oldest, most long used PFAS. They're also two that we know some of the most about, both in terms of how they move through the environment, where they come from, what they were used in, but also how they affect our bodies. And it turns out that they are incredibly toxic, even at very, very low levels. And what that looks like, for instance, in the drinking water standard that EPA published in 2024, is that EPA found that there is no safe level of exposure over time to these chemicals because they are likely to cause cancer, certain kinds of cancer, birth defect, or developmental issues in developing fetuses and young children, and immune resistance. Or resistance to vaccines, and higher cholesterol and heart and liver and lung impact. So there's a lot of different.
Can you dig into that a little bit more, Zach? Because one comment that I've heard is, people's lives, we're living longer. People are getting healthier. And so when we come in and say, actually, there's this chemical that's been in the environment for 60, 70 years, and it's giving us more cancer. Can you talk a little bit more about the data on when we say your increase of cancer goes up, your increase of autoimmune diseases go up? Can you touch on, because the data is actually pretty stark, how high the risk is. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah. So one of the things about PFAS that it's a bit unique. I'm not saying totally unique among them. There's lots of other dangerous chemicals too. But a lot of these PFAS bioaccumulate. That means they add up in your body over time. Your body doesn't necessarily pass them through very well. So that's why, we're not talking about like rat poison. Like, you drink a bunch of rat poison, you're going to die, right?
And you're dead immediately. Yeah. This is not that.
This is not that. So I also don't want to scare people. Like, part of the challenge of this work is, is helping people understand when there is something that is truly a risk, that's truly dangerous, but you also don't need to worry about it in this moment. I mean, we need to take action. So how do you compel action when there's not, a car crash right in front of you? Because I know there's lots of other, whether you call them, whether your analogy is car crashes or front burner items or the rat point, like we know that in government, there's lots of things in front of decision makers and policymakers all the time. A lot of them really are urgent. What's hard about PFAS is that we have to act urgently so that it doesn't become that problem down the road. And I'm not saying it's not a problem now. There are absolutely people whose health is being impacted now, whose lives are, who have the health, are experiencing those health effects. It's challenging to sort of trace the straight line from a PFAS exposure to a death, for instance. But we know that those impacts are there, and there are communities around the country, especially those near places where there have been really enormous and egregious PFAS contamination problems. There's places in Maine and Wisconsin and New York, in Parkersburg, West Virginia, and in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where a lot of these places are where there's factories that either make the PFAS or use those raw PFAS ingredients to manufacture other substances, where the contamination levels have been so high that there really are people who, cancer rates are through the roof, and people are dying strange and much earlier deaths than they really should relative to the rest of the population. Maryland has been fortunate not to have those factories in the state, that we do have other factories that use or add PFAS to manufacture other products, and that's something that we definitely have concerns about. But because they bioaccumulate, and there's a lot, like I said, there's thousands of different PFAS, they bioaccumulate at different rates. Some of them have different health effects. And so one of the things we want to do is approach this with, take a science-based approach to this. But to do that, we need information, we need data. And that's one area where we really rely on the federal government, on EPA, to do that science and research, or to collect the research and the literature that's been produced by doctors and hospitals and academic researchers around the country and around the world, and to tell us how toxic are different PFAS, and what are those health effects, and what are the technologies and the treatment solutions we have to get rid of them or to destroy them. And so what we do know, for instance, about these ones like PFOA and PFOS, for which we established drinking water standards at EPA last year, was that exposure at very, very low levels, close to zero, can cause cancer and these adverse health effects. And so EPA set a national drinking water limit of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. Now, that's several orders of magnitude even more restrictive than the contaminant levels that EPA said is acceptable for lead. Just to give you a comparison, that lead, the acceptable levels, or the quote unquote safe levels, are in the parts per billion. So that's 3 fewer zeros than with PFAS, which are in the parts per trillion. So we're working with numbers that are almost impossible to even imagine the scale or how small an amount of these substances, if you're exposed to it regularly for days or weeks or months in years in your drinking water, would lead to these health effects.
So I want to make sure that we are tying to for our audience. So we're talking about these PFAS chemicals. So they're everywhere. They're in our consumer products. They're in industrial processes. EPA is coming out and they're saying that, this stuff is more toxic than lead. And so it's going to be, 3 zeros less when you're doing your calculations. It's even a smaller percentage that you want to make sure you're eliminating this. But how does that tie with kind of county governments, and why should, if you're a county commissioner listening to this, why should you pay attention right now? And that's because all this stuff ends up in our wastewater. We want to remove it from our drinking water, which I think we're doing a pretty good job of. But because it's in all these household products, that goes to the county wastewater treatment facility. Counties act as passive receivers because we're receiving all of that waste. And then, you're talking about this bioaccumulating. So effectively right now is one of the ways that county wastewater treatment facilities operate efficiently and effectively is we use effluent from our wastewater treatment facilities as fertilizer. And we have a compound there that's pretty good for the plants. We can offer it relatively cheaper and have more positive environmental benefits than using standard fertilizer. But we're now learning that some of that effluent might have PFAS contamination. And as you're talking about, it builds up in the environment, we're now potentially opening up an additional exposure pathway through our food supply. And so if I'm a county commissioner, okay, all of this sounds like a big deal, but I don't control popcorn packaging. I don't control makeup or the factory. It's that inner loop with the wastewater treatment and how we handle that. And one of the things you and I have been talking a lot about over the interim is how do we, go about fixing that, and the idea of producer responsibility. So very brief, because I want to talk about some other stuff, but kind of, do you have anything you want to add there? Did I miss anything on that part?
No, that's right. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why I think folks at the county level, do care about this, should care about this. I mean, partly this is an issue that's going to be with all of us for decades. This is an issue, whether anybody wants it or not, that we're going to be grappling with, in great part because constituents are bringing it to us. It's like we're not just pushing PFAS action on Marylanders. We're hearing demand from people around the state saying, what are you going to do about the PFAS in my well? What are you going to do about the PFAS in my product? What are you going to do to protect my health? And we get those questions. We know county government gets those questions, and the state, works directly. In a lot of cases, programs are delegated to the county level, and so this is something that we're going to be dealing with for decades, as in government collectively. So it's helpful to just all be talking about this now, which is one of the reasons I'm so grateful for you and your leadership, Dom, in just helping to educate everybody in your world about this, so that we can all have really informed conversations about what works, what doesn't work. And this isn't something where I want to say that we all need to panic right now. We absolutely do not need to panic. What we need to do is act deliberately and with urgency in some areas, and to triage. There's going to be places where there's high risk exposure potential right now that we should take action to solve. And that's things like drinking water in some cases. I mean, and just to stay on that for just a second, we've done early monitoring in Maryland of all of the community water systems, the public drinking water systems that serve about 90% of Maryland's population. And the good news is that most systems are already in compliance with the EPA levels. We think there may be about 60 systems serving about 200,000 people in the state that do have, they will have to take some action to bring those levels down, but it becomes a much more manageable, lower temperature conversation when we have data, when we have information. There's clear data from EPA about here's what the standard is. There's information that we have in Maryland now about where we think that the PFAS is above those levels in drinking water. And then we can start to, work very thoughtfully on what are the plans that each community or each water system that is impacted should take. And that might be switching their drinking water source. It might be installing filtration. It might be drilling a new well. So there's different kinds of it becomes a very sort of brass tacks conversation. And we fully appreciate that some of those things take money and that resources becomes a part of it. But those are all problems that we can start to wrap our heads around. Now, then we go to other areas where PFAS is an issue at the county level. We know that firefighting foam, municipal fire departments may have AFFF that contain this aqueous film forming foam that contains PFAS. There's a take-back program that the General Assembly established and that we're just starting to operationalize right now to help.
By the way, quick side note, General Assembly established that in 2024, or no, sorry, not 2024, 2022. That was my first bill. That was like the first bill that I worked on at Mako negotiating that take-back program. So it's like weird to see the pieces come together finally.
It's just like I was saying, it's like cool to see things that you worked on coming into reality. And so it's like, so we thanks to that bill, we now know, because we did this survey last year of where there's stocks of AFFF sitting at fire departments, because most fire departments, I also want to reassure people, most fire departments are not out there spraying PFAS foam on everywhere. It's used in special situations where there's particular kinds of fires or particular temperatures or situations, like
an airport. I was just going to say, yeah.
Yeah, and many municipal fire departments may have bought it because they thought, there could be a time when there might be a need for that. But mostly it's sitting in 5-gallon buckets or drums, at a fire department. And especially now that there are alternatives, because, Congress recognized this is bad. This stuff is toxic. So they directed EPA and the Department of Defense to invent an alternative. And so now there are alternatives out there. And so that's being phased in at airports and military bases so that in the future we can still put out aircraft fires, because that's important too, but also do it without causing contamination, this kind of environmental and health contamination. So one of the things that we're going to be doing is pulling those gallons of those thousands of gallons of AFFF back and sending it to be destroyed, because that's another thing that's important to recognize about PFAS. I don't like when people call them forever chemicals, because it makes people think these things can't be dealt with or they can't be destroyed. They can be destroyed. It's that we want to be thoughtful about where we intervene and how we intervene, because there's a really expensive, really hard way to do this, or there's a much, much more cost-effective and safe way to do this. And that's what I'm trying to bring to MDE's approach on PFAS. So one is, like you were saying, it's in products that we all use. It's in products that end up in county landfills, that end up in wastewater, that end up in, materials that are being used at parks and playgrounds. And so we want to get it out of the products first. That's a really important step. Is there may be some cases where we need PFAS right now, but where the exposure isn't as where the juice is worth the squeeze, and where the exposure and health risks are lower. I mean, in certain types of electronics or manufacturing or medical technologies. But
let me stop you there, just because I want to get to some other stuff, and you and I can sit here and talk about PFAS all day. I think the big takeaways are we already are working on it, but we're going to be working on this really hard during session. I do want to give a shout out really quick to Senator Love, Delegate Stein, Delegate Ruth. And I think there's a couple other legislators I forgot, as well as the other interest groups that we're working with on the environmental side, et cetera. Because this is going to be something we're going to be taking a stab at, and good things are coming. But some of the other stuff that I want to talk to you about is the question of climate change and sea level rise. Maryland, we're really unique because we have one of the longest coastlines. We're a small state, but we have one of the longest coastlines in the country. And so we just had flooding, not on our coasts, but actually in Western Maryland. So Zach, let's, touch on kind of that whole big thing. How does Maryland prepare for climate change? You're updating your stormwater regs. We're seeing all the stuff going on in the federal government with FEMA. So broadly kind of touch on that and what MDE is doing in that space.
No, that's a great question. I mean, this is obviously, another huge area of importance for our department, for the state as a whole, for county governments, and we're grappling with the impacts of climate change everywhere. We're grappling with it, when, people in rural areas are trying to get a new septic, drainage field approved, and the water table's higher than it used to be. Or, where, like you mentioned the flooding in Western Maryland this year, which, we're not, flooding isn't anything new to the state, but it's happening with a frequency and at a magnitude and in areas that we're not used to seeing it at. And so that's one of the reasons that, we've been taking action, obviously, with Climate Solutions Now, and a lot of the work to mitigate climate change. The state has been working on this really aggressively for years, but there's also the whole adaptation and resilience side of it too. And so we want to be, when a developer is building a new housing development, we want to make sure that development is that those homes aren't going to be flooded, that those that the stormwater management practices that they install are going to work, and what may have worked 20 years ago or 30 years ago might not work right now. And so that's why one of the things that we're doing is updating the data, the data of rainfall and how water moves through the environment in Maryland, to help make more informed decisions when people are building new homes or commercial properties. We also are flexing new muscles in disaster response and pre-disaster mitigation. And so, we've been working very sort of closely with some of the Western Maryland counties that really learned where a lot of their literal bottlenecks are in some of their waterways, to make sure that they can be prepared for a similar kind of event next year if it happens. Now, one of the things we want to extend across the state is just let's map where those risks are. Let's know where we're going to have problems. Like we were talking about with PFAS, it's like you can't change what you don't know much about. And so a lot of these maps that the state has and the counties haven't been updated in decades, since I believe some hurricane back in the 70s. And so in the 80s and 90s, the state went through an exercise to identify where those risks are. It's time to do that again. And so that's one of the things you'll be seeing more of from MDE. And then, we're updating our stormwater regs. We're updating our mitigation banking regs, which I know that it starts to get weedy. There's particular sectors and industries like the building industry where that's really important, where we want to give more flexibility and more tools to developers to build more housing, because, we also are trying to address housing affordability issues, but we also want to do it in a way that's protective of the state's wetlands and the resources that make Maryland the amazing place to live and work and play that it is. But we can give people more. Yeah.
I want to stop you right there. I want to expand on that point because you touched on it before and you said it kind of more explicitly right now. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting, and it's an issue that we don't bring MDE into enough, I feel like, actually, to our detriment. So housing affordability, that will probably be the central issue this coming session. We know that the governor will have multiple bills. MACO, we have our Bambi, Build Affordably in My Backyard Act that we'll have. But the point that you brought up, that not only do we have to make policy trade-offs on, energy efficiency, but also like wetlands and what areas are we going to preserve? And if we're going to build housing here, how long should we plan to have that housing? Because if we know in 30 to 50 years that area is going to be underwater, is that sustainable? Is that going to help us now, but then be a massive detriment in the future? And so I think kind of all of those bigger conversations, it's similar to PFAS where, listen, the house isn't on fire today, but if we don't do something, it will be on fire tomorrow. We have to include MDE more, and that's a side of this issue that I feel like isn't appreciated enough. So I'm just happy you brought that up. I wanted to expand on it a little bit.
Yeah, I completely agree. These issues are all, in some respects intertwined, but certainly, on similar paths where, just like we were talking about with pre-disaster, preparedness, $1 of work up front is worth $6 or $7 on the back end. If you gave me that investment opportunity, I take it every day. And that's what we're talking about when it comes to PFAS too. When it comes to protecting our state's wetlands and balancing that with our housing needs. And this is an area where I do think that there are solutions and approaches where we can have our cake and eat it too. We can protect wetlands and have these issues don't have to be in conflict with each other. We just have to be thoughtful and smart about it. And so one of the things I really like about what I've been experiencing at MDE is we have some of the smartest people I've ever met and worked with working on these issues. The people who lead our air office, our land office, our water office, and a lot of the managers and supervisors there, and the rank and file staff have such good ideas. And so capturing those ideas, but then not operating in a vacuum of just our ideas, then like going out and having convenings with with industry, with environmental groups, with county government. I mean, I learned so much. I've only been in the state 11 months. I've been now to summer Mako and winter Mako, and I have learned so much at both of those conferences. Whenever I go out and talk to MAMWA, the water association in the state, I learn so much, and that feedback loop makes our work better. And it doesn't mean that we weaken our stuff because of that feedback. It means that we get smarter about how to do it. And there may end up being trade-offs at times, that there's that old saying in, policy and politics is that, you've done your job when everybody's unhappy. We don't think that actually has to be the case. There are some of these policy solutions where we can be really elegant in our approach, and everybody gets a piece of what they need in the end. And so that's one of the things that I've really enjoyed about working, with, not just, great staff here at MDE, but then going out and having, there's right now, I think they technically closed today, these advanced notices of rulemakings on stormwater and on mitigation banking. But we can still take more input on them because they are we haven't started the formal process. That's the point I'm making, is that we want to get as much feedback from all perspectives as we can as we make these decisions, because we know that I don't think there's many Marylanders out there who don't like the Bay, who don't like public health, who don't like, affordable.
So that's
housing.
like putting out fires. I don't think that's a bipartisan issue.
No,
Everybody loves
there's that one guy who's really pro fire. I guess we shouldn't
pave over it.
There are some people probably who are pro fire, but like I think we share, in almost all respects, the sort of end goals we're trying to reach. It's just, what are all the different factors? What are all the different variables that need to be considered when we're making these decisions to make sure that we do it right, that we achieve the outcomes, and we limit the negative unintended consequences of them. That's why, on PFAS, I might come across sometimes as a PFAS hawk, but I'm not saying no PFAS nowhere ever again at any time. There's going to be places where we need to use them because of how important they are to some things. They're used in medical technology. And if I was on the operating table today and doctor said, I need to put this device in you to keep your heart beating, I'd say, yeah, go do it. But maybe we don't need it in in the lip gloss my kid is using, or the sunscreen that we put on her. And there are plenty of lip glosses and sunscreens that don't have it. And the more that states take action on things like, certain types of product phase outs, the more that industry responds. This is a dialogue. And that's why I think that having a dialogue with the regulated community, with stakeholders, with advocates, just makes everything that we do better.
I gotta say, I have to give a massive shout out to your pragmatic approach. The fact that you've only been there for 11 months. So I think longtime listeners of this podcast will know that we don't count time in years or days or months. We count it in sessions. And so the fact that we're going into the second session with you here, I think that's why I confuse the two. But I really have to say that the way you go about this, and there are times that you and I vehemently disagree, but it's never a negative disagreement. We always are solution driven and kind of trying to find the way to yes. And so I just personally really appreciate that. I really appreciate the approach of MDE. I do want to transition the conversation. So we're recording this less than a week before Christmas, and I have some really hard hitting journalistic questions for you right now. I'm gonna rapid fire here because tis the season. So first, what's your favorite Christmas movie?
Favorite Christmas movie? I love the old Miracle on 34th Street, like the old black and white one with the great scene where they drag all those bags of mail into the courtroom. That's one of my favorites.
You are the only person who has answered that I've asked that has not said Elf. I'm just gonna hot take. Someone doesn't like Elf. All right. Live or artificial Christmas tree? And I will say people are keenly listening because you work for MDE. So both answers are wrong, but live or artificial?
I know. So I had to deal with that question with my daughter because at home we say trees are a family value. But then, Daddy, why are we cutting down a tree to put in our house? So we are a live Christmas tree family.
Trees are a family val. Can you explain that, please? Because there's just no like, tell me you work for MDE without telling me you work for MDE.
Yeah, well, no, it actually, honestly, it started when my daughter was in preschool, and there were all these conversations about like, what are your family or what are your values as a member of this preschool community? And I'm like, I don't know you. I'm not sure I'm comfortable having that conversation yet. But my wife and I, we just like being out in the woods and taking walks in nature, and we said, you know what, trees are a family value. But then, it works. It's like we really like trees.
All right. All right. So favorite type of candy cane? Are you like a traditional mint or do you like these new fruity flavors?
I like the traditional ones that you can just like stir in your hot chocolate and they gradually melt. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And then favorite Christmas carol? Do you have a favorite or do you like are you a Rudolph kind of guy?
I am an old school like I'm Jewish. My wife is Christian, but I'm the one that starts putting on the Christmas music in like July and gets
Oh my
yelled at.
God.
Um, and I like the old, like the classical still, like Adeste Fideles and Hark the Herald Angels Sing. So, just put those on, turn the volume all the way up, and rock out on my way to Annapolis.
So do you guys have then do you have like a blended, do you do Hanukkah and Christmas?
We do both. I love both. I mean, I think that there's a lot. I'm actually the son of a rabbi, so like we didn't like celebrate Christmas growing up, and so I was always jealous of all my friends with Christmas trees. And so it's like it's a treat for me now to like in my own life get to do that. But it means I'm starting from scratch, building a collection of ornaments, and
But that's the fun part. You get to like you get to go out and buy. Oh, that's the expensive part too, though. So wait, for your kids then, is it because it's 8 days of Hanukkah and you get one present per day, right?
Yeah, we do. It ends up becoming a mush by the end of it.
I was gonna say, so do they get like 8 presents and then they also get presents? Like, is it just like, is your bank account just screaming at the end of
My
December?
bank account's always screaming. We rely on a lot of grandparent presents by the end of the 8 days, and by the time Christmas rolls around.
Awesome, awesome. All right, well, I'm gonna wrap it up here, Zach. Thank you very much for being on the
Well,
pod.
hold
This
on.
has
What's
been
your
fabulous.
favorite Christmas carol?
Oh, my favorite Christmas. I actually hot take. I actually don't like Christmas music because I feel like it's the same four songs played every year. But Sia has some like modern poppy Christmas
Hmm.
stuff she put out like a year or two ago. So I will suffer through that.
All right. Well, I guess that means that before session, I need to make you a mixtape.
Yes.
I need to make you a mix CD of the best Christmas music, and we'll turn you this Jewish rabbi's kid. We'll bring you over to Christmas music.
It'll be a Christmas miracle, Zach. And if there's anyone in Annapolis who I want making a mixtape for me, it is Zach Schafer, Assistant Secretary at UPE. Well, thank you, my friend, for being on. This is a great kind of holiday season episode. I cannot wait to have you back, and I cannot wait to see you at session. Closing up, this is Dom with Mako. Shout out to our producer, Chantel, Malcolm Lynn, and I hope everyone's having a great holiday season.